This is one of my favorite stories, which is not known very well. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy put together something they called the XCOM, which was a group of his advisors, cabinet members. Bobby Kennedy was there, McNamara, and of course George Bundy. And the only Foreign Service officer there was Tommy Thompson, who'd served as ambassador to Moscow, who was one of our great experts after George Kennan. And in virtually every record of that 14 days of discussions about what policy should be and how to avoid nuclear war, Tommy Thompson, the ambassador, the person who just returned from ambassador, who knew Khrushchev, was the one they said was by far the most valuable person in the room, because he knew who Khrushchev was. He knew how to understand what they were thinking about and why he was saying what he was doing. And Bobby Kennedy, in his book on the subject, makes it very clear that the person who, at a key moment, moved them in the right direction, which avoided war, was Tommy Thompson, because he knew who they were. I mean, this is one of my pet phrases, know your enemy, which was not a new phrase. It was back in the 2nd century. Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War back in the 2nd century. He's a Chinese general philosopher who tried to explain how you deal with the enemy. And his basic point is, if you know the enemy and you know it well, and you know yourselves well, you can always win. But it also, the extension of that, is if you know the enemy well, you might not have to go to war. You might find ways to deal with this problem. And the United States really historically has, certainly in the 20th century and the 21st century, have not felt the need or compulsion to know your enemy. We certainly didn't know Vietnam. It was all run by Europeans. We certainly didn't know Iraq. All the Arabists were removed from policymaking, and the basic mistakes in those first days afterward, whether we should go in the first place, but also in the first days afterward. It was all run by the military and by political people who knew nothing about Iraq. And it's certainly a characteristic of where we are today. I guess my favorite story on knowing the enemy was when, after Kissinger became Secretary of State in '73, there was the Six-Day War, in which Israel invaded Egypt, and the whole region was in flames in a certain sense. And Henry, who was an expert on nuclear and Europe and to some degree the Soviet Union, knew very little about the Middle East. And what he did is he assembled the best group of Foreign Service officers we have. And I was working on his staff at the time, and I watched him do it. And he was skeptical at first, but he knew they had information he didn't have. And he proceeded over the next 6 months to work with Roy Atherton and Joe Sisko and a whole group of diplomats who knew the area, knew the issues, knew what had to be done. And he ran the show. He pulled the best out of them. And in the process, learned a lot about the Middle East that he didn't know about. You don't find secretaries of state often doing that. They bring their own trusted advisors with them. But they don't draw on the core knowledge that we have, that professionals had and developed over 20 to 30 years by the time they become ambassadors. And they know the issues. They probably aren't the decision makers. They're the advisors, and they're the ones who help the Secretary of State and the President know their enemy. And many people think diplomacy is just about avoiding war. That's not about what it is. It's not simply that. It's telling the American story. It's certainly negotiating agreements when you can find them present. But a core responsibility of the Foreign Service is to advise presidents and secretary of states on the real problem areas which might involve, as an alternative to diplomacy, military force. And I always feel walking into Congress that here comes this striped pants former diplomat who all he wants to do is sell us out. He wants to give up everything in order to have peace. I mean, that isn't our role. It's the president's role to decide on the use of military force. It's our role to help him learn whether he really needs to do that and learn enough about the opponent or the adversary so that he can find ways to get around the use of military force. And I would argue that over the next 50 years, next 100 years of our work, that dimension of U.S. relations abroad is going to be far more important than it was in the last 50 years.